You've been staring at that same task for 3 days. Not because you don't know how to do it, you know exactly how to do it. You've known since the moment it appeared. But you've checked your phone, made coffee, reorganized your workspace, responded to emails that could have waited. And the whole time, somewhere underneath all of that activity, there was a quieter thing happening. A negotiation with yourself about whether you were actually going to do this or not. That negotiation is not new. You've been having it for longer than you'd like to admit. Here is what's strange about that. The version of you that keeps finding reasons to wait, that version isn't lazy. It isn't weak. It knows exactly what needs to happen. The waiting isn't confusion. It's something else entirely. And the Stoics, people who lived in conditions far more demanding than anything you're facing, had a name for it. They understood what happens in the space between knowing and doing. And more importantly, they understood what it costs you to stay there. This video is about that space, about the decision you've already made but haven't yet honored, about the version of you that keeps getting postponed, and about what it actually takes to stop postponing it. Stay with me. The first thing to understand is that you don't have a motivation problem. You have an admission problem. There is something you want to do or stop doing, and you already know it. You've known for a while. But knowing and admitting are two different things. Knowing lives in your head. Admitting means you're accountable to it. And accountability is uncomfortable, because once you've admitted what you know, you can no longer pretend that the obstacle is information. The obstacle becomes you. Epictetus understood this better than almost anyone who ever lived. He was born into slavery, no choice about where he went, who he served, what he owned. He had fewer resources than you have right now, fewer options, fewer freedoms. And yet he became one of the most clear-eyed thinkers in the history of philosophy. He wrote this: "First, say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do." That line is not complicated, but it's brutal in the best way. First, say to yourself what you would be. Not what you want, not what you're planning to be someday. What you would be, right now, today. And then, do what you have to do. Not what's easy, not what feels natural. What you have to do. The gap between those two things is where most people live. You know who you want to be. The question is whether you've said it to yourself clearly enough to be held to it. You already know the answer. You've known for a while. The question was never what to do. It was whether you were willing to stop pretending you didn't. Now pay attention to this. The second thing is harder to see because it looks productive. You've been preparing, reading, researching, planning, setting up systems, waiting for conditions to align. And there's nothing wrong with preparation. But there's a version of preparation that has nothing to do with getting ready. There's a version that is simply a more sophisticated way of staying still. You can feel the difference, even if you haven't named it. Real preparation moves towards something. The other kind circles. It gets more detailed, more refined, more organized, and never actually goes anywhere. Seneca, who spent most of his life watching people, wealthy, powerful, educated people, find every possible way to avoid the thing they most needed to do, wrote this: "While we wait for life, life passes." He wasn't talking about people who were idle. He was talking about people who were busy. Busy preparing, busy planning, busy doing everything except the thing that actually required something from them. You know what it feels like when you're doing that. There's a specific kind of tiredness that comes from a day full of activity that produced nothing you actually care about. That tiredness is information. Preparation has an expiration date. At some point, it stops being a ladder and starts being a place to hide. Here is the part that matters. The third shift is where things get uncomfortable, but stay with it, because this is where the real information lives. You're not afraid of failing. You failed before, at things that mattered, at things you cared about, and you recovered. You're still here. Failure, the ordinary kind, doesn't break you. You know that by now. What you're actually afraid of is something more specific. You're afraid of trying your absolute hardest and still falling short. Because if you fail while holding something back, you can tell yourself the story that you just didn't go all in. That story protects you. It keeps a version of your potential intact, untested, safe. But if you give everything, if you bring the fullest version of yourself to the thing, and it still doesn't work, then what? Then you don't have the story anymore. Then it's just the result. Marcus Aurelius knew what it felt like to carry that weight. He was the most powerful man in the Roman world, and he still sat with his own private journal and wrote things he never intended anyone to read. Things like, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." He wasn't writing that for posterity. He was writing it because he needed to hear it. Even he had to remind himself where his actual power lived, not in the outcome, not in whether things worked out the way he planned, in the decision to show up fully regardless. That fear you're carrying, the one about giving everything and still not being enough, it's not a warning. It's a compass. It points directly at the thing you most need to walk toward. But there is something underneath this. The fourth thing is something most people sense, but can't quite articulate. You have a version of yourself in your mind, not a fantasy, something more specific than that. An image of how you want to move through the world. The person who does the hard thing first, who doesn't check their phone before they've done the work that matters, who handles difficulty with a certain steadiness, who keeps the promises they make to themselves. That version of you isn't a stranger. You recognize them. You've been them before, in moments, in stretches, in seasons that felt like the truest version of your life. But somewhere between then and now, the gap opened up. And every day that passes without closing it, the gap gets a little harder to look at. Not because you're getting worse, but because you can see what you're not doing, and you know why. The Stoics called this the inner Daimon, the truest version of yourself that exists beneath the habits, the compromises, the accommodations you've made to make life easier. That version doesn't disappear when you ignore it. It waits. You've been doing it so long you've forgotten there was ever a version of you that didn't carry that distance. That version of you isn't a destination, it's a direction. The only question is whether you're willing to start walking. Now watch what happens next. The fifth shift is about what discipline actually feels like from the inside, not what it looks like from the outside. Because from the outside, discipline looks like early mornings and cold showers, and people who seem to operate on a different frequency than everyone else. It looks like they want what most people don't want. The difficulty, the resistance, the discomfort. But that's not what's happening. The people you're watching who are doing the thing consistently, they don't love the resistance any more than you do. They feel the same pull toward comfort, the same preference for the easier path. The difference is not that they've overcome that feeling. The difference is that they've stopped waiting for the feeling to change before they act. You've been waiting for motivation to arrive before you start. But here's what the Stoics understood about action. The feeling follows the doing, not the other way around. You don't get clarity and then act. You act, and then clarity arrives. You don't feel ready and then begin. You begin, and readiness builds. Motivation gets you started once. It shows up occasionally, unpredictably, and it's useful when it comes. But it cannot be the foundation. Discipline, the kind that actually changes things, is what you do on the days when motivation isn't there. And there will always be more of those days than the other kind. That's not a problem. That's the actual work. Here is what most people miss. The sixth thing is the one nobody wants to sit with. Think back 5 years. Where were you? What were you telling yourself then? What were you planning, preparing for, about to start? And now look at where you are today. In the places where things changed, where did the change actually come from? And in the places where nothing moved, what was the story you kept telling yourself about why? Here is the thing about time that the Stoics returned to over and over again, not as a way to create anxiety, but as a way to create clarity. It moves at exactly the same rate, regardless of what you do with it. Seneca put it plainly: we suffer more often in imagination than in reality. The suffering you're imagining on the other side of the decision, the difficulty, the uncertainty, the discomfort of change, is almost certainly larger in your mind than it will be in practice. The actual doing is rarely as hard as the anticipating. But the years pass either way. 5 years from now, you will have lived them. The question is only who you'll be when you get there. The seventh shift is the one that makes the other 6 possible. And it's smaller than you think. You've been imagining the first step as something large, a commitment, a declaration, a complete change of direction. But the first step is not an action. It's a decision. A quiet, internal shift that happens before any of it becomes visible. It's the moment you stop negotiating with yourself about whether you're actually going to do this. The moment you stop leaving the door open for the version of yourself that keeps finding reasons to wait. Marcus Aurelius wrote this in his journal, not for an audience, not to sound wise, but because he needed to say it to himself. Confine yourself to the present. Not the version of you that will exist when conditions are better, not the version of you that will start when you feel more ready. The version of you that exists right now, in this moment, with what you currently have. That is the only version of you that can do anything. And that version has already decided. You made the decision the moment something in this conversation landed differently than it has before. What happens next is simply whether you're willing to honor it. You're going to close this video and go back to your life. The same tasks, the same decisions that were waiting before you pressed play. Nothing about those things has changed. But something in you has. Even if it's small, even if it's quiet. There is something you've been carrying that is slightly less comfortable now than it was 20 minutes ago. That discomfort is not a problem. That discomfort is the thing working. The Stoics didn't believe transformation came from grand gestures or sudden awakenings. They believed it came from what you did next. From the small, unremarkable decision to act in alignment with who you said you were, even when no one was watching, even when nothing about the moment felt significant. You don't need more information. You don't need better conditions. You don't need to feel ready. There is something right in front of you, something you've known about for longer than you'd like to admit. That's where this starts. Not someday, not when the time is right. Right now. In the next thing you do after this ends.